Within the next 24 hours, Soviet ships crossing the Atlantic on their way to Cuba are expected to encounter ships of the U.S. Navy. The U.S. naval vessels have orders from President Kennedy to stop and search all ships going to Cuba and to sink those who refuse to obey orders. According to intelligence reports, Soviet captains have orders not to allow their cargoes to be searched. Unless Moscow countermands these orders, an occasion for war may arise. Cuban leader Fidel Castro described President Kennedy as savage, barbaric, and shameless. All armed forces have been ordered to battle stations.
How did a small Caribbean island push the two superpowers to the verge of nuclear war? Cuba is only 90 miles from the United States mainland, and Americans have long considered it to be in their backyard. In the 1950s, the American government supported the military dictatorship of President Batista. American investment in Cuba was huge, the island's economy almost entirely dependent on the sale of sugar to the United States. The poverty of many Cubans meant that they were ready to give their support to the revolution led by Fidel Castro, which overthrew Batista in 1959. Castro now wanted to ensure that Cuba's assets were used for the benefit of the people. To end foreign exploitation, private companies were taken over. The Americans retaliated by cutting all trade links. Castro had to look elsewhere for financial help and a market for Cuban sugar. He found it from the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev.
News just in confirms that troops of both East and West have been put in an increased state of readiness. American forces as far afield as Korea and Pearl Harbor have been alerted. While in Florida, the nearest mainland to Cuba, there's continuing intense activity at military and air bases. The Soviet Union have ordered the increased readiness of their forces. Moscow radio said that Washington was raising its armed fist over Cuba and pushing the world towards war.
With both sides armed with nuclear missiles, a war between them would have disastrous consequences. As the crisis escalated, it was with Nikita Khrushchev that the final decisions on the Soviet side would rest. Khrushchev had risen to supreme power from poverty and was only too aware of the need to improve the standard of living. To help achieve this, he needed to reduce the huge expenditure on armaments and challenge capitalism in other ways. In 1959, as the first Soviet leader to visit the United States, he made his feelings clear.
Но посмеетесь, когда мы, знаете, обгоним вас и скажем: господа капиталисты, до свидания, наш поезд сюда идет. Пожалуйста, за нами.
You may perhaps laugh now, but when we overtake you, wave our hands and say, capitalists, goodbye. Our train is going ahead. Catch up if you can.
The jollity couldn't last. Khrushchev had to prove to hardliners at home and his rival communists, the Chinese, that he was not selling communism out. He badly needed a Cold War victory to prove Soviet strength. It was in this atmosphere that he met the American president in Vienna. The two men could not have been more different. John Kennedy came from a large, rich Boston-Irish family. His youthfulness, good looks, intelligence and natural charm made him an ideal candidate for the Democrats in the 1960 presidential elections. Kennedy campaigned as a tough anti-Soviet warrior.
You take the view that we must do better.
In a nationally televised debate, he charged Richard Nixon and the Republican Party with allowing a missile gap to develop in the Soviets' favor.
I believe the Soviet Union is first in outer space. We may have made more shots, but the size of their rocket thrust and all the rest. You yourself said to Khrushchev, you may be ahead of us in rocket thrust, but we're ahead of you in color television. I think that color television is not as important as rocket thrust.
This question of rocket thrust was very important because both sides used powerful rockets to deliver their nuclear missiles. To threaten the cities of the USA, the Soviets had developed intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, huge rockets fired from Soviet soil over the North Pole to the United States. The Americans also had ICBMs, as well as shorter-range nuclear missiles based in countries surrounding the Soviet Union, like Turkey. The Soviets didn't have more missiles. but many Americans believed that this missile gap existed.
So help you God. So help me God.
Once elected, Kennedy continued to talk tough.
Let all our neighbors know that we shall join with them to oppose aggression or subversion anywhere in the Americas. And let every other power know that this hemisphere intends to remain the master of its own house.
Kennedy was already aware that the Soviets had gained a foothold in Cuba. When the CIA presented him with an invasion plan, drawn up under his predecessor Eisenhower, he agreed. In April 1961, Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs. The plan was to provoke an uprising leading to Castro's collapse. But the invasion was a complete failure. Kennedy had got his first difficult decision totally wrong and had been made to look foolish and aggressive.
President Kennedy is to address the American people on radio and television 2 hours from now on a subject of the highest national urgency. And there's growing speculation that he'll announce a major American move over Cuba. A force of 40 warships and 20,000 men has assembled in the Caribbean, though the Defense Department says this is for an annual exercise and has nothing to do with Cuba. Today's New York newspapers all carried big headlines on the crisis. One said the government was preparing public opinion for the possibility of war.
This wasn't the first time Kennedy had been aware of the possibility of war. When he met Khrushchev in Vienna in 1961, both men wanted to prove their own and their country's strength. In spite of the smiles for the cameras, it had been an icy encounter. The most explosive issue was Berlin. Khrushchev wanted the Western Allies out of the divided city. Kennedy warned him that he was prepared to stand by West Berlin and that a major crisis there could lead to war.
The world is not deceived by the communist attempt to label Berlin as a hotbed of war. There is peace in Berlin today. The source of world trouble and tension is Moscow, not Berlin.
The showdown came quickly. To halt the massive flow of refugees to the west, East German troops sealed the border with West Berlin. Kennedy did not act. Khrushchev thought the young president was weak and inexperienced. He'd bungled the Bay of Pigs affair and now accepted the Berlin Wall. Both sides now began an arms race, building more and more nuclear weapons. With tension mounting, Kennedy began to take notice of intelligence reports showing an increase of Soviet activity in Cuba. He could accept the Soviets supplying the Cubans with defensive weapons, but not using Cuba as a strategic base for offensive weapons to attack the USA. He ordered more U-2 flights over the island. The U-2 was used by the Americans for photographic surveillance. Its powerful cameras could make out fine details from 12 miles up. Even so, Khrushchev denied the presence of long-range missiles in Cuba.
What is the reason for this witches' Sabbath staged in Congress and in the American press about Cuba? The Soviet Union has no need to shift its weapons for repelling aggression to any other country. Our nuclear weapons are so powerful, and the Soviet Union has such powerful rockets to carry these nuclear warheads that there is no need to search for sites beyond the boundaries of the Soviet Union.
If the Soviets launched their intercontinental ballistic missiles, the USA's sophisticated warning system in the Arctic would detect them. If there were Soviet missiles based in Cuba, they would bypass the warning system completely and destroy almost every city in the USA without warning. On Monday, October the 15th, intelligence experts examining the latest set of U-2 photographs found the hard evidence they'd been looking for. The Soviets were installing launch pads in Cuba for offensive weapons, medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles. The Americans could clearly see the Erector launches, missile transporters, fuel trucks, radar vans and missile shelter tents, and a nuclear warhead bunker under construction. The president was shown the photographs at 8 a.m. on Tuesday, October the 16th. The information was to remain top secret. Kennedy summoned 16 of his top advisors to the White House to form ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. During the first week of the crisis, they met in secret several times a day. Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, was a leading member. New photographs coming in from the U-2s added to the urgency. They showed an extremely rapid build-up of missile sites. It would be only a matter of weeks before they'd be ready to fire. On Thursday, October the 18th, Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet foreign minister, would not be drawn. He assured Kennedy there were no offensive weapons on Cuba. It was now up to the president to make the first move.